Hey everyone, welcome to Steven Universe, the show where we talk about the universe of Steven Universe. I'm your host, Victor Frost. First things first, the news. So, it's been a long time coming, but we finally have a clean version of the extended theme that was premiered at San Diego Comic-Con this year. Now, when, if ever, it's going to be used in the show is still questionable, but it is worth watching if only to see adorable little kid Steven. It's also further proof, for those who doubt, that the demo episode entitled Pilot is in fact not part of the show's canon. At all. Period. There's also a contest going on that all of you should know about. The Recipes Wiki on Wikia is holding its third annual Battle of the Fantasy Foods, wherein they gather 64 fictional foodstuffs and made-up menu items from communities all across Wikia and pit them against each other in 5 rounds of bracketed voting. After all 5 rounds, the remaining fantasy food will be crowned the winner, insofar as you can crown a fictional food item, and the entire round 5 bracket will be made available for purchase at the Wikia Fantasy Food Truck at New York Comic-Con 2015 in October. Presently, we are in round 4 with the following matchups open for voting.
Okay, quick revision to the video. We are actually in round 5 now. So it is now Cookie Cat versus Nuka-Cola. We beat the SpongeBob SquarePants Krabby Patty. So back to your regularly scheduled Victorness in front of a set.
Hit the link in the description and go cast your votes, and may the odds be ever in our favor. Also, you may have noticed that this episode is a day late.
2 days late.
That being the case, punishment protocol is now in effect. You are now free to post your ideas for what I should do as punishment in the comments. Remember, nothing excessively dangerous, expensive, or adult in nature. Embarrassing, however, is unfortunately fine. This is supposed to be a disincentive for lateness, after all. Now it's time to look at the show and see what we learn about a character. Yes, we're trying something new. I'm going to be referencing the entire story to date, so if you haven't seen all the episodes, this is your spoiler alert. Old episodes, new information. Let's see what we learned. So this time, instead of reviewing an old episode, we'll be looking at my number 2 favorite character, Greg. In this video, we're going to do our best to answer one simple question. How old is he? To do this, we're going to examine information from 3 categories. Number 1, explicit information we learned from the show, staff members, and other credible sources. This includes things like dialogue between characters, on-screen actions, interviews with and statements by Steven Universe crew, and the Newsarama interview. This will not include the comics, even though they are canon, simply because I haven't read them yet. Number 2, information we can reasonably infer from the show. These are things that are not explicitly confirmed by the show, but can be logically concluded based on evidence and reasoning. For example, given that Beach City is an otherwise seemingly average town, and that Steven, Lars, and all the cool kids have smartphones, we can reasonably infer that smartphones are not uncommon. Combined with what we know about other technology present in the world, such as the presence and age of audio equipment, cars, computers, etc., we can come to the reasonable conclusion that humanity in the world of Steven Universe has followed a technological arc similar to our own. And number 3, assumptions. Now, assumptions by nature have little to no evidence supporting them and are thus the weakest and least credible source of information to draw off of. That being the case, I will do my best to go with only the safest assumptions that I can, and I'll let you know what's an assumption, what's an inference, and what's a fact. With all that in mind, let's begin. One of the things that really bugs me is the total lack of any known ages for any of the characters. Since this obviously includes Greg, trying to figure out how old he is going to take some doing. But surprisingly, there is more information about him than any of the other characters. Starting with the first and only source to give a number that we can work from, Greg says in the Newsarama interview that his last tour was 30 years ago. Working our way backwards and assuming our calendars roughly match up, that traces us back to the 1980s, the mid-1980s, which is supported by even more evidence. No, not Pearl's leg warmers. We know that Greg gave up touring when he met Rose, so we can look at the episode Story for Steven for other evidence to either support or disprove the mid-80s as a hypothesis. Since we don't see any calendars or newspapers in the episode, we have to look at technology to help us date it. At his concert, Greg sells CDs, so as a new artist, CDs would have to be popular enough to be a viable option for album sales without it being an enormous expense to produce. Were CDs common in the 1980s? Absolutely. In 1985, the Dire Straits album Brothers in Arms became the first CD to sell more than 1 million copies, and is still one of the most successful CD releases of all time. So, CDs as popular in the 90s? Check. The other piece of evidence we have is in Greg's van. In the present, his van can play CDs, but not tapes. We know this from the close-up of the stereo in Full Disclosure. However, that is clearly an aftermarket upgrade, since we see in Story for Steven that it is a completely different unit. And since we know that Greg has had that van since as far back as Story for Steven, we can safely assume that that is the factory installed stereo. In our universe, cars started commonly coming with CD players in the 90s, but they were available in the US as aftermarket upgrades by the late 80s. As a musician, it would only make sense for him to want to have a CD player in his car as soon as he could, indicating that Story for Steven took place just before then, jiving with the placement in the mid-80s. So now that we have his age as no less than 30 with both canon and inferential evidence to support it and place it in time, let's try to narrow that down again by figuring out how old he might have been 30 years ago. The big fact that stands out is his dialogue saying that he didn't drop out of community college for nothing. Now, you can enter community college as a minor before graduating high school, but to enter most colleges, you have to at least be on track for graduating high school or have your GED. That, however, is an edge case, so let's assume Greg went to the most common route and entered community college straight out of high school. We know that school in the Steven Universe lets out during the summer. So if he graduated high school in June and entered community college in September, he would have to be at least 18 on entering. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to start Montessori at 5 years old, which is the minimum. So we have 18. If he stayed in college the 1 semester minimum to be able to technically qualify for what many colleges define as dropping out, that still puts us at 18. And let's assume that touring with Marty was the impetus for dropping out and that he signed his contract with him right after filing the papers with the college. We know that he was on tour for a while, so let's give that a year. Now, we've gone through all of that. Where does that leave us age-wise? Well, taking a conservative estimation on the unknowns, we can pretty safely say that Greg is currently at least 49 years old. Personally, I think he's in his early 50s, but with the evidence we have, I'd rather err on the side of younger. So, 49 it is, at least from this estimation. And that's what we learned this time on Steven Universe. Join us next week on Steven Universe Behind the Screen as I indulge my inner television data nerd and explain to all of you how those funny things called television ratings work. I'm Victor Frost, and I'll see you next time on Steven Universe Behind the Screen.